Hey, what's going on, everyone? Hope you're all doing great today. So I just finished checking out the brand new update for Days Gone Remastered, and I've got to say, it's one of those small but pretty interesting patches that actually tells us a lot more about where PlayStation is heading with their ecosystem, rather than just what's happening inside the game itself. This one's labeled patch 1.036.180, and while at first glance it doesn't look like a huge deal, because honestly, the changelog is incredibly short, it actually adds a feature that connects straight to something new, Sony's been experimenting with lately, the power saver for games mode. And if you're a fan of performance tweaks, energy saving, or just want to understand why this kind of patch even matters, then yeah, stick with me because there's more to unpack here than it might seem. Now, for anyone who hasn't kept up with all the recent PlayStation updates, the power saver for games feature is basically Sony's way of giving users a bit more control over how their console manages power, heat, and energy efficiency, without necessarily having to compromise the overall gameplay experience too much. Think of it like a system-wide performance mode, but in reverse. Instead of pushing your console to the limit for maximum fidelity and frame rates, this option allows you to slightly tone down the performance profile, so your console uses less electricity and runs cooler. And now Days Gone Remastered is one of the latest titles to support this. The patch itself doesn't include new missions, bug fixes, or gameplay adjustments. No stealth mechanic tweaks or Freaker AI upgrades this time around. But the fact that this update exists at all shows that Ben's studio and PlayStation are keeping the remastered version of Days Gone in their long-term ecosystem updates. Remember, Days Gone originally released on PS4 back in 2019, and the remastered version already enhanced it for PS5 hardware, with better frame rates, resolution, and load times. So, to see it still getting attention in 2025 with a system-level feature patch, it's honestly impressive. When you look at what this new Power Saver for Games mode actually does, the goal is all about efficiency. Once you turn it on, your console will dynamically adjust the game's performance profile. So, for example, if you're running the game on performance mode at 60 frames per second, enabling Power Saver could potentially drop that down to around 40 or 45 frames, depending on what Sony's algorithms decide is best for energy efficiency. The resolution may also scale slightly lower in certain areas, like during open-world exploration or heavy horde battles. It's subtle, but it adds up over time, especially if you're someone who plays long sessions. Now, let's talk about where you actually find this option, because a lot of players might miss it if they're not looking for it. You'll need to go into your PS5 settings menu, then head to System, Power Saving, and you'll see a new section labeled Power Saver for Games. Inside that, you can toggle the setting and choose which supported games it applies to. When you select Days Gone Remastered, you'll have the option to let the system handle the adjustments automatically. It's a pretty clean implementation, and what's nice is that it doesn't force the change globally across all titles. You can pick and choose which ones to include. I tested this out for a bit just to see if there was any visible difference, and honestly, it's very subtle. The game still looks great, still runs smooth, and the environmental details, especially during those foggy Oregon mornings or those intense nighttime ambushes, all hold up really well. The lighting and shadows may appear just a touch softer in Power Saver mode, but if you weren't specifically comparing it side by side with the normal mode, you might not even notice it. What you might notice instead is that your console fan runs a little quieter, and the temperature seems more stable during longer sessions. It's clear Sony's been rolling out this feature across multiple first-party and remastered titles lately. Games like Ghost of Tsushima Director's Cut, Horizon Forbidden West, and The Last of Us Part 1 have all received similar small patches, adding this compatibility. That consistency suggests that Sony's trying to make Power Saver a standard feature across all of their modern PlayStation titles, possibly as part of a broader sustainability initiative, or maybe even as preparation for whatever's next in their hardware roadmap. It's not a flashy change, but it's a smart one, because once more people start using it, Sony gets valuable data on how their performance scaling impacts gameplay. Now, if you're wondering whether this affects how you play Days Gone itself, the answer is pretty simple. It doesn't change the gameplay mechanics or story pacing in any way. Deacon St. John is still the rugged, stubborn, and surprisingly heartfelt biker trying to survive the post-apocalyptic chaos of freakers and human outlaws. The open world still feels alive. The hordes are still terrifying when you stumble into one unprepared, and the game's atmosphere remains one of its strongest points. All that remains untouched. What this patch really changes is the underlying experience of how your system runs the game. And that's kind of what makes this update more interesting the longer you think about it. Days Gone is a game that's always balanced between chaos and calm. Long stretches of exploration, scavenging, maintaining your bike, then suddenly you're sprinting for your life as 100 freakers chase you through an abandoned sawmill. The intensity of those moments has always depended on smooth frame pacing and quick loading, and the remaster nailed that on PS5. So now that there's a power saver mode layered on top, it shows how confident Ben's studio is in their optimization. They wouldn't roll out something that breaks that pacing. And in testing, the frame consistency remains impressively steady even when power saver is enabled. Another small but nice aspect of this patch is how it fits with the recent history of updates for the game. Earlier this year, the previous big patch, 1.036.116, addressed a long list of bugs from UI glitches to horde assault issues and even tweaks in photo mode. Then a smaller one in July cleaned up performance hiccups and fixed a few crash scenarios. That means by the time this latest patch landed, Days Gone Remastered was already in a very stable place. So this new patch is purely additive. It doesn't fix something broken, it just expands the feature set. That's the kind of patch every player likes to see because it means the developers aren't scrambling to fix problems, they're improving the long-term experience. It's also worth thinking about how this update interacts with the PS5's built-in performance modes. If you've played Days Gone Remastered, you know there are different visual settings you can toggle depending on whether you prioritize resolution or performance. Typically, you'd choose between a high-resolution mode that targets 4K at 30 FPS or a performance mode that runs at 60 FPS with slightly lower visual fidelity. When Power Saver is turned on, it seems to dynamically adjust whichever of those settings you're currently using, rather than overriding it. So if you're a frame rate junkie and you can't stand anything below 60, you might want to leave Power Saver off. But if you play casually and you'd rather keep your console cooler and maybe save a bit on energy costs, then it's a nice feature to have on standby. This kind of update also makes me wonder if Sony might eventually integrate an automatic mode that changes profiles based on what you're doing. Imagine if the system could detect when you're idling at a camp or doing menu work and switch into power saver mode automatically, then ramp up performance during combat. That kind of adaptive system-level scaling could be the next big step in console optimization. And seeing games like Days Gone already compatible with power saver means the groundwork for that might already be happening. Now, for anyone who's revisiting Days Gone or maybe picking it up for the first time, this is actually a great excuse to jump back in. Even without new gameplay content, the game's atmosphere feels more immersive than ever on the PS5 hardware. The loading times are practically non-existent, the dynamic weather still looks stunning, and the soundtrack continues to hit perfectly in those quieter, story-driven moments. The remaster really gave this game the second life it deserved, and patches like this show that it's not being forgotten. There's also a subtle sense of nostalgia with Days Gone at this point. It's one of those games that didn't get the recognition it probably deserved at launch. But over the years, it's built this loyal community that genuinely appreciates its tone, pacing, and story. Seeing it still receive system-level updates in 2025 feels like a little nod to that community from Ben Studio and Sony. Even if this patch doesn't bring in massive gameplay changes, it still says, hey, we haven't abandoned this world. And that's something fans definitely appreciate. If you're curious how this patch might affect your specific setup, it depends a lot on your display and preferences. If you're playing on a 4K 120Hz monitor, you might not want Power Saver on at all. But if you're gaming on a standard 60Hz display and just want smooth performance without the console running too warm, turning it on could be worth it. It doesn't introduce input lag or noticeable frame skipping in my tests, which is a good sign. It's subtle efficiency rather than compromise. So yeah, that's the full story with the latest Days Gone Remastered update. Not a flashy headline grabber, but an example of PlayStation's ecosystem quietly evolving under the surface. It's kind of like maintenance for the future, laying the foundation for smarter, more sustainable console gaming. And for a title like Days Gone, which is all about surviving against the odds, it feels fitting that it's still adapting and evolving even years after release. Anyway, that's pretty much everything worth knowing about this patch. If you plan on jumping back into the game, it's a great time to test out the Power Saver feature and see if it fits your playstyle. Maybe you won't notice much difference, maybe you'll appreciate how your PS5 stays quieter, but either way, it's cool to see the game getting continued love. I'll be keeping an eye on how this system-wide feature develops across other PlayStation titles too, because it looks like this is just the start of something bigger. So yeah, that's it for today's update breakdown. Let me know in the comments if you've tried Power Saver yet, or if you even noticed the update drop. Do you prefer your games running full power, or are you open to these efficiency tweaks? I'm curious what you all think, especially for games like Days Gone, where atmosphere and smoothness both matter so much. Thanks for watching, take care of yourselves, and I'll catch you in the next one.